Hi there, I'm Dr. John Walden of Galen University and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. Joining me today, we have
Marielle Puccia, Archives Officer 1 of the Belize Archives and Records Service.
we want to thank the organisers for putting on another wonderful cultural symposium, and we're delighted to be here today to present to you our ongoing research, which combines history and archaeology to understand the colonial period at Lower Dover in Cayo District. So, a brief background to the colonial logging industry. Traditionally, logwood was being exported from British Honduras prior to the 7 Years' War, during which time the price became devalued and loggers began prioritising mahogany, which thrived further inland away from the waterways along which the logwood grew. So, as loggers began moving further inland, this put them in direct contact with Indigenous Maya groups living within British Honduras.
Lower Dover, as we know it today, is a small portion of what was originally the Mount Hope work. The area that is being excavated currently is situated at the confluence of the Belize River and Barton Creek. Okay, so what I have been doing from my end at the Belize Archives with the records is to try and trace basically the history of the Mount Hope area of which Lower Dover is a part of. And so what we have done is gone into the records to see what we can ascertain of the people who were there and what they were doing there. So from what we have gathered is we know that before 1787, it was a logging work. It was being used as a logging work. They were extracting logwood and then later on moving on to mahogany. The land had passed through several owners from that date all the way up until the 1960s when the government took it over. But what we have been seeing consistently from the records is that the land itself was always used for the extraction of some kind of timber up until about the 1920s when it changed to pasture land and farming.
One of the first major historical events that impacted the region was the Enslaved People's Revolt of 1820, which was led by William Sharper. This began over in the Roaring Creek area, where 40 enslaved peoples bravely rose up against their overlords, although this spread up the Belize River to the Barton Creek.
And we get a really good account of this event from Edward Main, who was actually living at Mount Hope at the time. He writes a letter to the magistrates on the 18th explaining what he experienced on his time at the bank. He speaks to the fact that the men went to the bank, broke open his stores, stole all the provisions, and basically slaughtered all the cattle that he had and left them to rot in the pasture. Two of his men actually joined the rebellion.
Many of the events we're discussing today can be set against the broader backdrop of the caste war in Quintana Roo and Yucatan. The British colonial regime were largely arming the Creoles Mayas who were fighting against the Mexican government. And the Mexican government, in turn, were arming the Icaiche or the Pacifico Mayas based at Chichen. As British loggers increasingly started to claim further inland territories in order to log the mahogany, this saw them encroaching on the territories which were traditionally considered Maya. This saw Mayas raiding across the border of British Honduras, and over time saw the splintering off of an Icaiche faction from Chichen, which moved down to San Pedro, Siris, Yolbak, and other communities, San Jose, in the northern part of Cayo District. Over time, tensions flared between these Maya groups and the British loggers based in the Belize Valley, and this ultimately culminated in a series of demands made by the Mayas as the British loggers penetrated further into Maya land, and saw a series of raids against the loggers based at the Mount Hope Works in 1867, and a simultaneous raid against Indian Church the same day.
What the records are showing us prior to the destruction of Mount Hope in February of 1867 is what actually the events that led up to it. We know that James Phillips was captured by the Icaiche while extracting on his mahogany work in Laboring Creek. The following day, on the 5th, all the foremen employed by the Young Toledo and Company, who actually owned the land, receive letters from the head chief, Marcus Canol, basically instructing them that they needed to pay rents because they were logging on what they considered Maya land. Anticipating that there would be attacks on these gangs for non-payment, the company instructed a foreman to basically remove all the laborers, equipment, personal provisions that they could and take it to Orange Walk, which is a camp that is located around what is present-day Roaring Creek. This is also where the troops who were escorting Edward Llewellyn Rees would be stationed. On the 19th, they marched to San Pedro, where they were supposed to meet with the Indians there to try and formulate a plan of peace moving forward. That failed spectacularly. All the troops returned on the 20th, and by the 21st, all the laborers who were waiting there with the troops for safety actually abandon the area, and everybody leaves to Belize City, abandoning all the works. Now, looking at a more localized perspective of Mount Hope itself, we know that that is actually where Joseph Case's mahogany work was. We know that on the 13th, he left with his laborers to Orange Walk, but he left a couple men behind. From the reports that we get from both Edward Llewellyn Rees and the men left behind on the 19th, we know that they were actually surrounded by a number of these Icaiche men while they were packing up their pit pan to leave. They talk about the fact that they ransacked the provision stores that they had. They opened up their bank chests and they stole a horse and some equipment. This is a small raid that happens there, but it is not actually the destruction itself. From the reports, we learned that the actual destruction of the work happens on the 4th of February, 1867. There were 2 attacks that were done, one on Indian Church and one on Mount Hope, when the camp itself was completely destroyed. This is not the first and it's not the last set of events that happens between these two groups. We know that in 1868, Marcus Canol once again is writing to the British, stating that he has responsibility or ownership of these lands, and again exacting rents from the British.
Archaeological investigation of Lower Dover began in 2009 and mostly focused on the ancient Maya centre present. During his dissertation fieldwork at the site, Dr. Rafael Guerra noted the presence of historic ceramics and glass bottles down near the confluence of the Belize River and Barton Creek. More recently, I learnt the story of the Icaiche destruction of the Mount Hope Works from Don Hector Silva and Mr. Alfonso Zul, both of whom seemingly have visited the area in the 1970s. They told me that there might be some interesting history to be found in the area, and so in 2004 we started an archaeological metal detection survey to look for the historic component of the site. Archaeological metal detecting was used to define the edges of the historic period site. Dr. Sheldon Skaggs of the Bronx Community College conducted a low-frequency metal detecting survey using multiple transects laid out across the area. These were 1.5 metres wide and spread 10 metres apart. As artefacts were discovered, they were flagged and excavated. There was also a series of 1 by 1 metre test units placed. Overall, 3 large transects running north-south were carried out, including 1 running east-west, and then several more peripheral transects to delimit the edges of the site. The map on the right here shows the different artifacts that are clustered around, and it's pretty clear that it's a very dense configuration in the middle, and this comprises a lot of personal items, domestic items, some logging equipment, but surprisingly little logging equipment, but quite a surprising amount of weaponry. So while we know that the area that was Lower Dover was part of the Mount Hope Mahogany Works, it's quite hard to tie in with all these records that we have historically. So the logging items that we found today include a bearded axe on the lower right, several other axes, and what's called a log dog that was being used for chaining and transporting and hauling logs. Perhaps most surprisingly, we found a litany of weaponry strewn around the ground surface. Most of this was less than 10 centimetres, 15 centimetres deep, and this included two muzzle loading closed breech black powder muskets, and you can see the barrels right at the top there. The percussion lock from 1840s Fowler musket, a cutlass, and probably 20 or 30 pieces of lead shot from muskets. In addition to this were a series of shorter knives, and so it was surprising how well armed the occupants of the site would have probably been. In addition to logging equipment and the weaponry, we found a multiplicity of domestic and personal items. This included a series of leather working scissors, clothing including belt buckles, small signet ring, part of a harmonica, some clay pipes, and a folding razor. In addition to this were a whole load of other items, including glass bottles, several metal cauldrons, lids, plates, pans, knives. On the right you can see a selection of the different pottery that we recovered from the site, and this included quite a lot of probably British made Cornish porcelain with the willow pattern style. Most of these materials that we're talking about here date from the period of about 1840 onwards. We also this summer found a 1834 William IV silver 1.5 penny. This was minted for consumption of the colonies in the West Indies. And this, along with a lot of the other artifacts, including the ceramics, the weaponry, suggested that the large deposit that we seem to have encountered at the confluence probably formed some point between 1850 and 1880, based on the relative ages of the vast majority of the objects we've discovered. So the archaeological record and the historical record has really started to converge to tell us just how rife violence was up and down the Belize River at this time, as enslaved peoples and indigenous peoples were fighting oppression on the part of the British colonial regime. This research is fundamental to really understanding the scope of the colonial oppression and the ways in which different groups resisted that oppression, as well as the extractive nature of the logging economy. To date, the function and the historical trajectory of the Lower Dover Historic Site remain quite unclear. It's almost certainly part of the Mount Hope Works, but it seems to date from this later time period when the Mount Hope Works were destroyed, and when there's all this evidence of ongoing violence back and forth. We don't have good information about the earlier occupations that are documented so well in the archives, and so a future question will be really trying to tackle where are those elements of the site. In terms of future directions, what are you thinking?
Let's continue to dig. So that's the plan for the future direction. We're hoping to do a much vaster excavation of that area to see if there are other materials that we can find that would clear up some of the questions that we have now, or if that will result in other areas of interest, different time periods, things like that. And we're hoping to do that with students from Galen, with BVAR, and also the Community Archaeological Project. Of course, we will continue looking through the archives to see what the official records are saying. I mean, it's such a vast number of dispatches of paper that needs to go through, information to weed through. And of course, community interviews is very important to see what the people who are living in the area remember of the time, or stories that have passed down through the generations, and using a combination of all three of these things to see if it can give us a clearer picture of what is actually happening here.
Thank you all very much for listening and watching. We'd like to thank the organisers of this fantastic symposium for putting on another fantastic show, and we'd like to thank all the people who make our work possible.
And we hope that you will join us next year as we give you a bit of more information of what the new season brings.